So as I mentioned previously, I want to welcome everyone to our session today. This is the first of a series of 3 Lunch and Learns devoted to debugging. This first one is defogging debug logs. And I'm going to get started. Hi, my name is Linda Kane. I'm one of the co-leaders of this group. I have 12 certifications, all the Trailhead badges unless they've released new ones today. I've been in the ecosystem for 15 years and kind of made my way up to being a developer, starting out doing a lot of reporting and data analysis, moving on towards an admin role, and finally reaching to the point where I'm in a developer role. Just to give you some background. So our agenda for covering debug logs today. So why use debug logs? What are they for? Where to use the debug logs, ways you can access them, what trace logs are. That's one of the ways that we actually access debug logs, how to read the debug logs, which is, of course, one of the most important steps. And then I'm going to show 4 use cases with debug logs. The 2 first ones are primarily meant for those who are more of an admin role, so they can get used to it. I can tell you developers use those use cases all the time as well. And then the second 2 really get into the tools that are available and an interesting way to deal with data uploads for new functionality as primarily for developers. And then I have some resources that I will provide a QR code for at the end. As you have questions throughout, feel free to post them in the chat. I'll do my best to get to them. Orlando may butt in to help ask them to me if I haven't noticed them. So why use debug logs? The typical answer, of course, is to troubleshoot, understand the errors we're getting. Developers will use them when they're doing code development, especially as they're running tests to see how things are running. You can use them to check if things are running long. If a user's reached out and said, hey, this page takes a really long time to load, it's one of the ways you can use to find out why, as well as other things related to that. For a developer, also learning how existing code is affecting what you're doing now can be very helpful, and confirming how that order of execution is operating on the code you're writing. And then the last one, which is the example, one of the last examples I'll give, is as a way to kind of get to exportable data that really isn't available through easier methods. So where to use debug logs? Not that it's a really great debate, but oftentimes we are confronted with should I do this in production? Should I do this in the sandbox? Where's the safest place to do that? Most often you're going to want to troubleshoot in a sandbox if you can, especially if the issue you're presented with can be replicated there. If it can't, then maybe you need to do it in production, especially if you're using directly with a user where you're going to turn on trace logs. You may have to do that in production to get a look at what they're doing. You might be dealing with an integration for a product that's only within production, such as Marketing Cloud, where you don't really have access to it via a sandbox. And it could be that the issue you're seeing is only happening in production. It's fine in the sandbox. But the other things you also need to keep in mind is if you are troubleshooting in production is you can't edit code in production directly. So you won't be able to add things like system debug lines to code to make things more visible. In the sandbox, sometimes you want to replicate things. You might actually want to be able to compare what's happening in production to what's in the sandbox by checking the logs. Also, as a developer, you may actually only have been given access to the sandbox. So ways to get debug logs. So the first easy way to get debug logs is through the Developer Council. For those who haven't used Developer Council, when I get to the demo, I will make sure I show you where you access that. It is a tool within Salesforce. And basically, when you open it, the logs, for actions that you take as the user are generally generate automatically. So if you're making interactions with the user interface in Salesforce, those logs will generate automatically and you'll be able to see them in Developer Console. You can also run Nimbus Apex get logs as well as running tests to see those logs. Another way to get debug logs, especially if you want to generate them for a user who is not yourself, is to turn on trace logs for that user. Trace logs can be configured for the user. They can also be configured for classes and triggers specifically. However, configuration for classes and triggers do not generate the logs themselves. Instead, what they do is they override the current logging level set for users. So if you have classes that you want to see more or less information for, then in the typical log, you can set that up. Other things to remember about trace logs is there are limits, as with many things in Salesforce. So you can only get logs that are up to 20 megabyte, and they will actually overwrite deleting the older information if things are still running. Your org can only store 1,000 megabytes of logs at a time. You may have to go back and delete old ones for that. And there is a max rate for which logs will be generated. So you don't really want to keep them on all the time. You especially don't want to do that in a production org. So setting up trace logs. This is where I can set it up for a different user. In setup, I would follow the path posted here, which is environments log debug logs. I get to user trace flags, and there is a new button. When I click the new button, I get the window that's on my right. So I can set it up for user, choose who the user is, choose a start and end date. You can see this is from a while ago, but I chose basically a 5-minute interval. I really want to try to keep this short to keep from generating too many logs. And then the next thing is the debug level. There is a default debug level provided in your org. And then from there, you can also configure it to allow more or less detail at the user level. I will say you can click on the button that's on the screen for the new debug level. However, I still find it easier to set these ahead of time and do that from classic setup. The biggest thing to remember, though, for these various debug levels, which I'm going to get into a little more in a moment, is that the finer the setting is, you're going to get more information, but that log is also going to grow faster. So when I set up trace log levels initially, I will tend to make my own little logging level thing, and this is kind of where I like to start. This is not by any means the best or Salesforce recommended levels. This is what I find I like most often. So there are different categories for each, and then what the level, and then what I listed on here were some key events and why I choose that level. So for the database level, which is going to log you things that are like DML, your SQL queries, your SQL queries. At the info level, you get things like when those queries begin and end, or when those statements begin and end. For workflow, the finer level gets me quite a bit of detail about flows. And as a reminder, next week we have Mike DiMaria talking about his flow debug utility, which gets you even better detail. It also gets you general information about workflow and process builder if your org still has those. Validation rules info is pretty much the level I live on for that. Apex code finest, so I get as much detail as possible, except any of the levels though will give you information about errors and exceptions. Part of what I like about the finest level is I can see how variables are assigned when various methods are entered and code units are started. Visualforce, I usually start with info. If I need formula evaluation, the finer level is better. And then for system, fine lets me see system method entry as well as some trace flags. I do see one question, specific level category for custom metadata, custom settings. Not that I'm aware of. I know if you're querying them, pretty much the database levels should, or the database category should give you results for that. As well as if it's in your Apex code, you should be able to see that in any variable assignment you do. Just to point a few other debug level stuff. If you're using Finest for database, it also gives you the SOCL explain plan. There's limits you can set for Apex profiling. This is the section of the log that lets you know what limits you're reaching. Finest will get you most of those. If you're using callouts to get the results, you need Finer. If you just need no detail, fine. There are actual debug levels specifically for the old Wave tool, now known as, I want to say CRM Analytics. It changes its name often enough I can't keep track of it. And for Einstein Next Best Action as well. So the next part, once you've set up debug logs, before I get to this, one of the resources I have available from the QR code I'll provide at the end is really a listing by level of what events are included in each category.
Linda,
so that,
there's a question from Michael asking if there are trace org limits per person or for the entire org.
They're for the entire org. So they're not usually by person, they're by the org itself. All right, very good.
All good, no new questions.
Okay, okay. So, so reading the debug logs. I'm going to cover mostly reading these inside Developer Console. You can access them outside of Salesforce. There are ways to run debug logs and access them in VS Code. I'm not by any means an expert in that. You can also export out debug logs, both from where you access the trace logging, as well as from Developer Console itself. One of the things to point out here, which I'm showing on the screen, is if you need to see trace logs for a user other than yourself, under the debug menu in Developer Console, you're going to have to uncheck the box that says show my current logs only. Otherwise, you just see your own logs. Additionally, if the file is big, you can open the raw log or you can download the log. Outside of Salesforce, you can use pretty much any text editor once you've downloaded the files, or you can really open it in Excel because it is a pipe delimited file, which we'll get into a little bit here. So within once we open that file, the first 3 lines provide some general information about the log. That first line is the API version that ran, as well as what the debug level settings were. You'll only see this if you download. If you're in Dev Console, you won't see this particular line on the screen. Second line shows who's the user that you're debugging. So you'll see their ID and you'll see their username. You'll also see their time zone. Time zone's important because all the times in the log are listed in the time zone of the user who's logged, not in yours. And then the third line just lets you know the execution is started. Following that third line, all logs are pipe delimited. They will start with a timestamp. Again, as I mentioned, it's in the user's time zone. And then in parentheses, you'll see the elapsed time in nanoseconds. After that, you'll see basically the event identifier, as well as pieces of information that are used for that type of event. Various events collect different pieces of information. And then occasionally in the logs, there are summary segments that give you information about resource utilization and how you're doing against governor limits. So those lines that I mentioned for the events, each event has its own set of information that goes with it. I will say the pages, the developer pages from Salesforce are pretty good about telling you what's in those. I have kind of here on the list some examples of what's in them. So a user debug line will tell you the line of code, what the logging level was, and then what the value is that was in the system debug statement. Things like validation errors, there's various different pieces where the error just gives you the error message. Pass fail just tells you the name of the event. The rule will just give you the rule name. Method entry and system method entry tell you what line of code in that method. If it's non-system, it'll give you the Lightning ID of the class. And then often it'll give you the signature, or if it's a constructor, the class name. Here's a few others. I'll just note things like workflow rules. The event will start with WF. Flow, they'll begin with flow. Variable assignment is often helpful in that it gives you the line number in the code, what the variable name is, and a string representation of the value. And then for Apex errors that you come for exception thrown, they'll give you the line number, the type of the message, and fatal errors give you the type message and stack trace, which is what we'll often see if we're running tests and have errors. So when I get into my log for the first time, I felt over the years that I've learned how to use them, but when I first got into trying to figure out what was in these, I was pretty lost. So I really learned to rely on filtering to help me find my way around them. They're long, there's a lot of data in them. The filtering capability that's in DevCounsel makes it a little easier to get used to them. The easiest way is to see what the developer has chosen to give me for information. And by that, there's a simple filter based on debug. The only things I'll note is it doesn't let me really see the surrounding information while that filter is on, but at least it lets me see that information. Hopefully the debug statements that I'm given are useful and have enough detail so I can identify what I'm looking at rather than maybe just a value that I can't place. I found also searching for keywords like error, fail, fatal, and null pointer is also a common one I run into. Also help me find where information is that I need. Another thing is if I'm working with a particular record and I'm troubleshooting for a user, knowing what that record ID and searching the logs for the occurrences of that ID can be very helpful. And when I'm seeing those data lines, I'm looking for things like, are fields null that shouldn't be? Did data change between different occurrences where that record shows up? And what does it mean if I can't find that ID in the log at all? Am I looking at the right log, or did something really not happen? And then knowing those key events, I can also use that to search by to find that expected trigger or validation rule or automation that is happening in the org. So this gets us into the fun part, which brings us to demos. So this first demo is basically a simple error troubleshooting case. In this case, the users reached out. They sent me a screenshot of the error. Little helpful sometimes not. And we're going to go over the steps we're going to take. One, we're going to attempt to replicate the issue first. Can I get the same error message? And if so, can I do it while I've got DevCounsel on so I can see what's happening in the logs? If I can't replicate, I would probably set a trace on the user, have them retry, and then look at the logs. And then what am I going to look for once I get that log? I'm going to look for that error message that they got. I'm going to look for searching for things like fatal error. And I will mention stuff about manage Apex in a moment. I might look for the ID of the specific record if I'm not finding the rest and look at field values. And then how I'm going to resolve when I'm done is really going to depend on what that error is and what's been happening in my org. So I'm going to get out of the presentation for a moment and go into my org. So my user reached out and they sent me an error message. Actually, I'm going to go back to the presentation so you can see the error message really quick because it does not show up really long on my screen. So the error message looks like this. They took a screenshot. I know they're on an opportunity working and they're getting an error message saying they can't save their record and it's telling them they don't have permission or the record might have been deleted or archived. Really? While they're on the record? Okay. So going back to the org, what they told me was that they were trying to save an opportunity as closed one when they got this error message. So I'm going to see if I can replicate. I'm just going to pick an opportunity that's out here. I'm in a sandbox. We're going to pretend this is a sandbox and not a production org because, of course, I don't want to try to replicate in the production org and potentially change data that I don't want to change. So I'm just going to come here in my sandbox. I'm going to set this to close, select my stage, and I'm going to say close one like the user said they were doing. Fine. Yes, I'm getting the same error message. Don't have permission to edit. Really? I'm the system admin. Come on. So I'm going to go to DevCounsel. To get to DevCounsel, I click on the gear icon in the upper right, and you'll see under setup, service setup, there is developer console. It'll open up. I'll probably get an error message because I had stuff open and didn't close it properly last time. You can see right now, I'm on the logs tab automatically. There's nothing in the log because I haven't run anything yet. I ran that and got that error, but I did not have logging on, and I didn't have dev console open. I have dev console open now. I'm going to go back and replicate that error again. So I'm going to come right here, and once again, I'm going to select the close stage. Make sure I get the error message. And now when I return to dev console, I can see I have a log. Additionally, I can see the status in the log says insert failed. Gives me a good idea this is a log I probably want to look at. So I'm going to open this log by clicking on it, double clicking on it, and it opens. As mentioned, I don't see that first line that tells me the API version and the logging levels. I do, however, see the second line with the user info, so I know this was me. And in this org, I'm on Pacific Daylight Time, and I can see that executed started. I can widen this a little if I need to see the full name of the event. And I see my timestamp. I do not see the time in nanoseconds. If I downloaded the log, I would see that. So working with logs, I know that it shows status right here as failed. Maybe I think it'll be the last thing in the log. So usually when I start off with these, I scroll all the way down and I see, hey, what's at the bottom of the log? Is there anything useful? And in this case, I've got all these limits showing, and there's not much useful right at the bottom. I might have to scroll up a little bit and find it, or I can filter. So I'm going to start with a filter. And we know there's an error going on, so I'm going to filter, and I'm just going to type the word error in my filter and see what I get. And sure enough, I get some lines that show me there's a fatal error. If I look at the first line, it's telling me there's a DML exception, insert failed. That kind of follows what I saw in the status. And then what it's telling me after that, the first error is a field custom validation exception, and it's giving me the text of that validation. So follow-up task must be related to a contact. So there's something going on with task related to a contact in my opportunity. If I look down 2 lines in this error, it's showing me there's a trigger called closed op trigger, and something on line 19 is contributing to this error in some way. And again, then I'm seeing that validation message the line after. So what I could do is I could open that trigger, take a look at the code, see what's going on line 19. I'm going to save us a little bit of time because I already know what's going on there. In that trigger, when an opportunity is marked as closed won, I'm automatically creating a task for follow-up. Great. That's been in my org for a while. I know that because, it's been there quite a while. I've run into it before. But this validation error is something new that I have not run into before. So this follow-up task must be related to a contact. And if I think about it, an opportunity typically doesn't have a contact directly on it, and therefore that could be part of my problem. As I go back and I check what's happened in my org, or I reach out to other people, I learned that the business recently asked for a new validation rule that an admin put in that said that follow-up tasks have to have a contact. And I'm like, yeah, that's a problem for opportunities, especially since I don't have a direct relationship to a contact. Might reach out to that person who's aware of it to say, hey, how do we want to resolve this? For the sake of getting a person to, or my user to actually be able to complete their work, I might choose to temporarily inactivate the validation rule so they can continue their work. Or if I have enough time and can do it quickly enough, possibly resolve the code issue, get it deployed to production. In this case, I'm going to take the quick way out and actually modify and turn off that validation rule for now. I suspect that my fix in the long run will mean finding a way to either relate that follow-up task to a contact directly from maybe the opportunity contact role if it exists, or a specific contact on the account, maybe the first contact on the account I find even, but it's going to mean a change to my code. And like I said, the solution is going to depend on the organization you're working with and the needs of the business. And sometimes you're going to have to work with them to get there. So back to the question that was on there, would the log find an error thrown by a managed Apex class? So third-party code, it can find the error in the fact that it'll often tell you what class may be part of that error, but usually you can't get really into the detail to see what exactly is happening with that. I can give you an example. A few weeks ago with the new release, we were getting an error on some test classes. And that error basically told me it was a managed package trigger that was bringing out the error. Didn't give me a whole lot more other than there was a null pointer error. And it turns out that within that managed package, there are permission sets that have to be updated. Basically, with the release, there was a function to handle that. And by doing that, then the user, in theory, should have access to the fields that they were, or objects they were missing, so that then that test would actually run successfully. But what you get for managed third-party class error stuff is really limited. I don't know if there are other tools that will show you more detail. If there are, we may learn about it in 2 weeks with Nebula Logger if it gives us any of that detail. But I'm going to leave that for Orlando. He's used that tool more than I have. So back to our slideshow for a little bit here. Like I said, we showed that error. And then the filtering. So there's a question about filtering. If you check the filter option but don't enter any text, does it filter out some of the entries? That I do not know.
I don't think so, but yeah, good, interesting question.
Yeah, usually if you check that filter box, you actually have to put something in there, and it does it right away. So it's pretty quick. Same, and then the debug only will only filter for user debugs. Those are the two I use most often. But like I said, I'll filter and look for a record ID even. And then there's some other things I'll do as well with the I'll filter, I'll find the line, I'll click on the line and then uncheck my filter so that I can see the surrounding code quicker rather than having to scroll up and down and find it. So my second use case. So this one is pretty common for developers, but it's also a great way for admins to start learning about debug logs and explore what's going on in their org. So in this case, though, the developer wrote a new Apex class. Maybe they wrote the test class already. Maybe they haven't. Can hope they did, but you know, maybe we're just getting ready to write the test class and we have to figure out how we're going to write it. What I want to make sure if I'm going to use this method is that I'm including useful system debug statements in my class. And I do mean useful, not just I'm displaying a piece of information. And I don't know what that piece of information might be when it comes up. I might run my test if I've already written it in Dev Console, or I will use anonymous Apex to call that method in class that I want to test. I'm going to look for those user debugs, so probably using that debug filter. And I'm going to also look for things like where code started, where method entries happen, and maybe other things that I know about depending on the code. And then I'm going to use that to help me, you know, resolve any errors, fix code, recheck, rerun. Maybe even I'll find that I have to create additional things for my tests when I do that. So I'm going to get back to my org and developer console here. I'm going to close this log since we're done with this. And a while ago in this org, I wrote a quick little class for a 20-sided die for a game. I know, games and work applications. But as a way to help my daughter learn Flow, we were creating a role-playing game character builder. So I'm just going to come here and I'm going to open that class. Not the test class, just the class. If I can get my mouse to cooperate this morning, which apparently it does not want to. All right. Ooh. Nope, wrong one. That's not open. Open. All right. I'm going to sort this by name so I can find it. So random 20-sided die controller. Again, I can move things over if I need to. So I just want the class. I do not want the test class right now. So it's an invocable method because I'm going to use it in Flow, which means for those of you who may or may not be familiar, invocable methods have to take as a parameter at most a list and can return a list. It cannot return any other type or take any other type of parameter. And you're only allowed one invocable method per class. If I quickly scroll down, you can see there's only the one method in this class. You can see here I've added some system debugs. So on line 8, I'm declaring an integer of a specific size, and I'm calling it size with 20. And then in my debug, I'm prefacing the first line of my debug with some text so that I know what I'm going to show, and then I'm showing that variable. You could do this in one line. Just if you're going to do it in one line because it's an integer, you have to remember to use a value of so that you can convert to a string. And you'll see a little bit later, I have a second integer that I set as a result. I have debug to label that as my result before my math that I'm going to do and show it. Then I've got something going on where I'm doing some math. In this case, I'm getting a random number multiplied by the size. Random returns a number between 0 and 1, but not 1 itself. Believe. Yes, and then I'm rounding so that it rounds up. So I should never have, when I'm done, should never have a result of 0, and I should never have a result above, in this case, 20, which is my size. And then it's going to show me the result after it's run the math in here. And then finally, I'm putting my result in a list and returning it. So I'm going to just run some anonymous Apex to just call this class. Let me just, I don't want to lose this. So I'm just going to copy that really fast and go to Notepad and paste it because I'm going to need that in a little bit. All right. So I'm going to call this, I'm going to create a list of integers, right? Because that's what my return is. That I'm going to call my dice. So my new list of integer. And actually, I don't even have to do this part. I'm just going to say my dice equals, and I'm going to call random 20-sided dice, sided die controller, and the method sided die controller, which is get die roll. Okay. And I don't have to pass it anything. And then I'm going to just have right here my system debug for my output. And I'm just going to show the my dice. This should be the last thing that shows up in my debug, just for reference. And also to show you what it looks like if I haven't given it useful help around it. I'm just going to execute this and let it, I do have the choice to open or not open the log. I'm going to let this automatically open the log so that it will run and do that. So I mentioned I just really care about seeing those debug lines right now. So I'm going to check the debug only. And I can see here that debug line of the word sides is showing up, and it's showing me the 20 as I expected, the result before math with the 0, the result after math with 9. So that was the random number rounded that I got. And then I can see afterwards the last line that I added within the anonymous Apex. Because it's a list, it's showing in parentheses with the 9. I can also, as I mentioned before, I could filter out. So I can see these line numbers. And if I check these line numbers, they should correspond. So sides, where I had the sides, that's line 9. You'll notice for the last one, it's 2 because that was a line within the anonymous Apex. The other thing I can do is right here. So here's my result after math line. If I unfilter at this point, that line stays highlighted, and I can see stuff happening right around that line of code. So I can see that math random was called, that math round was called. And here at line 17, if I check my code here, line 17 is where I am indeed calling math round and math random. So it's not in the system method right here. Up here though, a few lines more, I can see the system methods called math, the first line. I'm not going to see a lot of detail about that because it is a system method, but at least I know it's using a system method. So again, you can do it by adding debugs, finding your places. You can just scroll through the log and learn and discover what's out there. If I were to scroll here, I can see here some variable scopes. This is a system class line, line 2 and 3, but it's calling functions that I know I didn't call in my code, but that apparently are just loading as part of that system class. Just things to be aware of. Now, if I'm a user, an admin, and I'm trying to do stuff and learn how things are happening, like I might open Dev Console up and go into my org and run some functionality, whether that be creating a record or editing a record. So like here, we're back at this record where we had stuff that wasn't working before. We turned off that validation rule. Say I'm an admin and I want to make sure things are working and things are getting called and that validation rule is not getting called anymore. I could, now that that change has happened, I could make my change here, do my close one. I see that it actually closes successfully. And I could check my log. Here's my most recent log. I can open it up and I could confirm that a validation is not running by searching for validation, if I can spell it correctly, just the word valid, so the start of it, and I'm not getting anything in my log at that point. However, I know there's also that trigger that runs, so I might even come here and filter on that trigger and see if that trigger is running, and sure enough, that trigger is running. Closed op trigger is running on an after update. And I can get into more detail and discover more for that too. Is there a way to confirm which file the line? Not easily. So it does take some understanding of what's going on within the log. So if I click here where the code start is, I know that in this case, because the code unit start is here, it's letting me know it's the closed op trigger on the opportunity trigger for an after event. That is usually a clue for me. But as for knowing how to relate the line back, often it's just going through and looking for that last code unit start or method entry and seeing, does the numbering kind of flow? If I then open that class and look at that method, does the line number match? Fortunately, it's not always straightforward.
Linda, also, Guna Sundari asked if you're going to show LWC/Aura component logging. I don't know, Guna Sundari, if you want to see like interactions up with the Apex backend or JavaScript console log.
Yeah, and that doesn't really get covered within the debug logs. They're more focused on Apex. And I don't do a lot of JavaScript logging, so probably not the best expert for that one. So we only have about 12 minutes left, so I want to make sure I get a chance to at least show you some of the things that are in the other demos I had planned for. So our third demo is really about long-running code. This really is more of a developer task, but it could be long-running code, a test class that takes too long, or even a user saying how long it takes to save a particular record. Could be taking quite a while sometimes, especially if there's a lot of code behind it. And what can we do as developers to help mitigate that? And how can we identify the best places for us to spend our time in order to mitigate that? Dev Console has some really neat tools with this. With this particular one where we save the record, I'm going to start there. So I'm going to close my other logs except for this one where I had my successful save. I'm going to kind of bring down the list of the logs so I have a little more screen real estate here as I do this. There are additional tools and views you can use within Dev Console for logs. They appear under this debug menu. There's an option called Switch Perspective. By default, we're on log only, which shows us the log. But there's an additional one called Analysis that has some interesting tools behind it that can be useful for visualizing. So I'm going to click on that, and you'll see pretty quickly it gives me a lot of different little views and boxes. I have my execution log, which is the part I've gotten used to looking at. It's the same window, but it's much smaller. I have some things that'll tell me about the tree and the performance, the execution stack. But what I want to point out is down here, the execution overview. Save order is not really doing much here. I just know there was a trigger that ran. But timeline gives me kind of a visual on the time that elapsed throughout the log and how long things take. Where is the majority of my time spent? And what's the longest things that I really want to look at? So I can see here this Apex session here is in green is, not really long compared to the DB call. If there were more, I could scroll and see more. This one is actually a pretty short example. But when I click on this green bar, you'll notice my event execution log actually changes, and it only shows me, automatically filters, and only shows me stuff with that category so that I can limit what I'm looking at and where I might be able to save some time. If I click on the DB side, it shows me what's running, which is just an insert task. That's probably not helpful as much as the Apex code would. I'm going to probably, if I'm working on trying to find ways to make things take less time, I'm going to be looking at where are those Apex code bars a little longer, and is there anything I can do about those as a developer? This is not a great example. It doesn't have a lot going on. If I go back in my logs and maybe I look for the one that I ran with, I think it's this one. Yes. So I think this is the one I ran for the dice thing. And I minimize this just to give you an idea how different they can look. I can, again, come here, switch to that analysis perspective, go to timeline, and I'll see there's some other stuff going on. There's a system method running here. Actually, this is something else that ran. So there's a list going on. Oh, it is my 20-sided dice. Okay. So my Apex code ran. The system method, so that's obviously when math was called. Not giving me a lot of detail about that, but then again, I can't do anything with the system method. And then at the end, the last part of that, where it's actually doing the rounding and stuff, it's showing. Do you have to switch each time you open a different log? So I'm finding that I do. I'm sure there are ways you can change and store the workspace as you want it within Dev Console, but I don't know how good that is at staying sticky. So just something to bring up that awareness is a tool that you can use. And then the last example that I had was really a use case situation that I had run into a while ago. I was doing a rather large deployment, and there was data that needed to be populated in a different new custom object from some objects that weren't easily queryable and able to be put together. I had actually originally written a script to do it, and that script was failing because of the sheer volume of records I was dealing with in production compared to the environments where I had tested. I was actually able to come up with a way to do the query, break it down to within the limits. Ran the first part of that. It ran fine, great, but then my second part just kept failing because I was hitting, actually in this case, too many SQL for my error. Didn't really have another good way to get at it. So what I ended up doing was modifying the script I used to, instead of actually doing that update, to provide the data I needed as pipe delimited so that I could then use it. So I have this script that is not exactly what I was doing, but gives you a place where you might need this. I find that anything using account contact role tends to be a little complex, or in this example, I'm using content document and content version, as well as content document link. We all know that content document link does not let us query lots of records at once. We can wish it did, but it doesn't. So this is a way I was able to get at that data for a given content document. So I'm really starting way up here, not down here, with my content version records. So all the ones where it's the latest record for the content version. I'm then creating a set of those so that just to make sure it's, for the content documents, going through that, iterating through it, getting that into a map so I can get at the linked entities. And then ultimately giving myself a list at the end of here's the content version, here's the title, here's what type of file it is, how big is the document, and then the links. How many things is it linked to? Is it linked to one thing? Is it linked to two things? What are those IDs so I can figure out what's going on in my org, and then putting those out with basically a pipe delimited text field that I can pull from the debug log. So I'm just going to copy this really quick. This org does not have a lot of documents in it, so it should run fairly quickly. I just want to lift this back up so I'll be able to see my logs. So open anonymous, I'm going to put this code back in. Let it run. Like I said, it runs fairly quickly because when I've run it today and two, there aren't a lot of content versions in this document, in the content version records in this org. And then when I filter on my debug logs, I can see some of the debug statements I had in that script earlier on, but then I can see the ones where I've got pipe delimited data with what looks like funky names, Panda Guitar, Bobcat Barb, and some others. And then I'm ending after the last pipe with what looks to be a comma separated list of IDs. Sometimes there's one, most of the time there's two, sometimes three. I can take this log, I can download it. Unfortunately, it doesn't download filtered. So when I download it, it's there. And when I open it, I can see there's a lot on here. Still, it's the full log. If I scroll down, I can see that it has a lot. It has like over 1,000 lines. It's not really going to get me exactly where I want to be yet. So from there, I would open it in Excel or a similar tool. I have an example of this. What I'll usually do first, and sorry, this is already filtered, so let me unfilter this. It's going to be cooperative when it opens all the way. What I do tend to do with this log is I will take this one and I will try to, the raw log, and I will try to find that first line and the last line of the debugs. So starting at the top, I'll just, search for my debug and the one I'm looking for, which is the first user debug where there's actually pipe delimited data. And I will strip, that's not it, it's the one after that. I will strip all the lines above that. I will then try to find the last one in the log, strip the lines below that. So I'm not trying to pull in all 1,034 lines. This is a fairly small one. I've had ones that are larger that Excel does not always like. So stripping that up before makes it a little easier. And then I can read it in. Like I said, it's a pipe delimited file, so I can read it in Excel, or in this case, Google Sheets as pipe delimited. I can give it a heading row of my choosing, and then I can use that to filter. So from here, I would choose to filter this by those that are marked as user debug. And then I got something else still selected. And then I can see just those lines. Notice though, in the line that it was pipe delimited of my data, it's replaced those with the ANSI code for pipe. So what I would probably do from here is get it down to just that particular column, and then replace that ampersand pound 124 semicolon with pipes again, like this. And then finally reopen that in a new tab as pipe delimited, and I can format it to my heart's delight to be able to use it to identify the records, how they're linked, what they're linked to. So I know like this document, Panda Guitar, is linked to a user and a second record of some type that I would have to go out and look at to figure out what it is. I happen to know it's a character record. And then this one, the Salesforce code, is actually linked to 2 different of those character records. But just becomes useful as a way to get at my data and try to find things when I can't get to it other ways.
Yeah, very cool. In a project, I use this VS Code extension from the former Financial Force called Apex Log Analyzer. I use it to try to improve the loading time of a recursive Apex. It was good. I'll throw the link in the chat. Also, Fabrice is giving in the chat good insight on how to create a custom perspective for the debugger.
Awesome. Thank you, Fabrice, for that. So getting back to our slideshow, I know we're really short on time. Cleaning up and removing old logs. Like I mentioned, there's that limit to how many logs you can have in the org at a time. There's a simple query that can be run in Dev Console. You do have to check the tooling API box because it is a tooling API query. It is not a standard object query. From there, you can select highlight rows, and then there's a delete row button that shows up so that you're able to remove them. You could also do that from in user setup. If they're trace logs, you can delete from there as well. This is a lot faster though. And I did promise you some resources. The QR code here actually takes you to the website with the deck and supplemental resources that's on here. It's a Google site that I keep. So the deck is a version of this deck from a user conference, as well as an additional resource document. I will bring this back up in a moment. Just wanted to show you what that looks like. So it's a resource document where I have by category, what are the different events for each logging level? What's the default? And then at the very end of the document are links back to Salesforce's documentation about logging levels, as well as the events and what's included in their logs. So thank you for joining us. This is that QR code again. I'm going to open it up if there are any other questions, and I know we're getting close to overtime. Orlando, you want to turn off recording?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.